December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. A state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Japan continues its military conquest throughout the Pacific. But back home, millions of American workers band together, bringing factories to life to avenge Pearl Harbor.
Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air. President Roosevelt has just announced.
In June 1942, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the United States and Japan clashed at a tiny coral atoll called Midway. Over 4 days of fierce fighting, the U.S. lost 1 aircraft carrier, while Japan lost 4, along with thousands of their best sailors and pilots. This wasn't just a naval battle. It was the turning point that decided the fate of the Pacific War. Midway teaches us that intelligence, decisive action, and the sacrifice of young pilots can change history. For our generation, those of us raised on stories of the greatest generation, this is part of our family legacy, a tale of courage and hope triumphing over despair. Mistake 1, an overly complex plan and scattered forces. Picture this, you're planning a big road trip with your buddies. You've got one main goal like hitting an epic beach, but instead of focusing everyone on that, you send some friends to the mountains, others to a city, and keep a few back home just in case. By the end, everyone's lost, and the plan's a total mess. That's Japan's first mistake in the Battle of Midway. Their plan was way too complicated, and their forces were spread thin, setting them up to fail from the get-go. It's June 1942, 6 months after Japan's stunning attack on Pearl Harbor. They're riding high, having conquered places like Singapore, the Philippines, and Hong Kong. Their navy, led by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, wants to lock down the Pacific by capturing Midway, a tiny coral atoll 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Midway's small but strategic. It's like a guard post in the middle of the ocean. Take it, and Japan could threaten Hawaii or even the US, West Coast. But here's where they tripped up. Yamamoto didn't just focus on Midway. He cooked up a plan that tried to do too much at once. Japan's strategy was like a spider web, big, bold, but fragile. The main force, called the Carrier Striking Force under Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, had 4 of Japan's top aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carrying over 200 planes, including Zero fighters, Aichi D-3A dive bombers, and Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers. These were the heavy hitters, the same ships that crushed Pearl Harbor. But instead of putting all their muscle into Midway, Yamamoto split his navy into multiple groups. A secondary force, with 2 smaller carriers, Ryujo and Junyo, was sent 2,000 miles north to attack the Aleutian Islands near Alaska, a diversion meant to confuse the Americans. Meanwhile, Yamamoto led a backup force, including the massive battleship Yamato, the most powerful ship in the world at the time. But it trailed 300 miles behind Nagumo's carriers, too far to help in a crunch. Other ships, like cruisers and destroyers, were scattered across the Pacific for support or potential follow-up invasions, like a possible attack on Hawaii. Why was this a problem? Think of it like a football team. Nagumo's carriers were the star players, but they were sent into the game without enough linemen or backups. The Aleutian attack was a sideshow. It didn't trick the US Navy, because the Americans, thanks to cracking Japan's secret code JN-25, knew it was a distraction. The Yamato and other heavy ships? Too far back to join the fight when things went south. On June 4th, 1942, when American dive bombers from the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown struck, Nagumo's force was isolated. The US, under Admiral Chester Nimitz, had concentrated all 3 of their carriers in a tight group northeast of Midway, ready to ambush. In just 5 to 6 minutes that morning, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were hit by bombs and set ablaze, largely because Japan had no extra ships or planes nearby to counter the attack. The consequences were brutal. Japan lost over 3,000 men, including veteran pilots who couldn't be replaced, and 3 carriers in one blow. The 4th, Hiryu, went down later that day. If Yamamoto had kept his forces together, say, sending those Aleutian carriers to Midway or keeping the Yamato closer, Japan might have had the strength to absorb the US attack or hit back harder. Instead, the scattered plan left Nagumo's carriers alone, like a boxer with no one in his corner. What's the lesson? When you're going for something big, keep it simple and focused. Japan wanted to conquer the Pacific, but trying to do too many things at once left them vulnerable. In life, it's the same. Spread yourself too thin, and you risk losing everything. If Japan had put all their eggs in the Midway basket, who knows how the battle might have turned out. Mistake 2. Poor reconnaissance and intelligence. Imagine you're playing a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek, but you're so cocky, you barely bother looking for it. Then, out of nowhere, they jump out from a spot you never checked, and you're done. That's Japan's second mistake at Midway. Their reconnaissance and intelligence were a complete disaster, leaving their fleet blind and ripe for an American ambush. It's early June 1942, and Japan's Navy, led by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, is steaming toward Midway Atoll to seize it and crush the U.S. Pacific Fleet, their biggest threat? The American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. If Japan could find and sink those, they'd own the Pacific. But to do that, they needed to know exactly where the U.S. ships were. Problem is, their scouting was sloppy, and their intelligence was practically non-existent. Japan had tools to spot the enemy, submarines to patrol the seas, and scout planes launched from cruisers. But their setup was a mess. Before the battle, they sent a line of submarines, called a picket line, to watch the waters between Hawaii and Midway for U.S. ships leaving Pearl Harbor. Sounds smart, right? Except the subs got there late. Some didn't arrive until June 3rd, 1942, just one day before the battle started. By then, the U.S. carriers had already slipped out to their ambush spot northeast of Midway. The subs saw nothing and reported zilch. What about air reconnaissance? Japan relied on float planes, slow, single-engine planes launched from cruisers like Tone and Chikuma. These planes were supposed to fan out and spot the enemy, but Japan didn't use enough of them, and their search patterns were poorly planned. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, things went from bad to worse. A scout plane from the cruiser Tone, tasked with searching the critical northeast sector, was delayed by a catapult malfunction and didn't take off until 30 minutes late, around 5 a.m. When it finally spotted U.S. ships at about 7:40 a.m., the pilot's report was vague, mentioning enemy ships, but not confirming they were carriers until later follow-up messages. This fuzzy intel reached Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who was commanding Japan's 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, while they were busy bombing Midway's airfields and defenses. By the time Nagumo got clearer reports around 8:30 a.m., he was already behind, caught in a scramble to rearm his planes. Why did this hurt so bad? Japan's lack of solid intel left them clueless about the U.S. carrier's position. Nagumo thought he had the upper hand, focusing all his planes on attacking Midway, leaving little for defense. Meanwhile, the U.S. had cracked Japan's secret code, JN-25, giving Admiral Chester Nimitz a playbook of Japan's plans, where their ships would be when they'd attack. Everything. Nimitz positioned his 3 carriers 200 miles northeast of Midway, perfectly placed for a surprise attack. At 10:20 a.m. on June 4th, while Japan's carriers were caught off guard, American SBD Dauntless dive bombers swooped in from high altitude. In just 5 to 6 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were hit by bombs, set ablaze, and effectively destroyed, with over 2,000 crew members lost in the inferno. If Japan had scouted better, say, launching more planes earlier or ensuring their subs were in place, they might have spotted the US carriers and adjusted their strategy, maybe keeping more fighters ready to defend. Their overconfidence and sloppy recon left them sitting ducks. It's like walking into a dark alley without checking your surroundings, thinking you're untouchable, only to get jumped. The lesson? Knowledge is power. Japan thought they had the Pacific under control, but without a clear picture of the enemy, they were set up to fail. In life, whether you're planning a project or making a big decision, you've got to do your homework, or you're just guessing in the dark. Mistake 3. Admiral Nagumo's hesitation sparks chaos. Imagine you're throwing a huge barbecue, but halfway through, you can't decide whether to grill burgers or hot dogs. You keep telling your crew to swap the meat, rearrange the coals, and before you know it, the grill's on fire and the whole party's ruined. That's Japan's third mistake at Midway. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's indecision about whether to arm his planes with bombs or torpedoes threw his fleet into chaos at the worst possible moment, leading to disaster. Here's the scene. It's the morning of June 4th, 1942, and Japan's 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, are steaming toward Midway Atoll, ready to crush the US defenses. These carriers are loaded with over 200 planes, including Zero fighters, Aichi D-3A dive bombers, and Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, the same planes that wrecked Pearl Harbor. At 4:30 a.m., Nagumo, commanding from Akagi, launches 108 planes to bomb Midway's airfields, aiming to knock out its defenses so Japan can invade. The attack hits around 6:20 a.m., blowing up fuel tanks, barracks, and the control tower. But the runway's still usable, and some US anti-aircraft guns are still firing. Around 7 a.m., the strike leader radios back. "We need another attack to finish Midway off." Nagumo, thinking he's got this in the bag, orders the roughly 90 planes still on his carriers, waiting in the hangars, to load up with bombs for a second strike on Midway. These planes had been armed with torpedoes, ready to hit ships, but now crews start the slow, messy process of swapping torpedoes for bombs. Picture dozens of sailors in cramped hangar decks, hauling 500-pound bombs, unhooking torpedoes, and refueling planes, with fuel hoses and ammo scattered everywhere. It's a logistical nightmare, taking 30 to 40 minutes per plane, and it clogs up the flight decks. Then, at 7:40 a.m., everything shifts. A scout plane from the cruiser Tone reports spotting US ships northeast of Midway, possibly including a carrier. Nagumo's in a tough spot. To attack a carrier, you need torpedoes, which hit below the waterline, where ships are most vulnerable. Bombs are great for land targets like Midway, but less effective against ships. Nagumo hesitates. Should he stick with the plan to hit Midway again, or switch back to torpedoes to take on the US fleet? At 8:09 a.m., he orders his crews to stop, remove the bombs, and reload torpedoes, a second swap in under an hour. This flip-flopping creates chaos. Hangar decks are now packed with bombs, torpedoes, fuel cans, and planes, all while US attacks from Midway. B-17s, TBF Avengers, and B-26 Marauders keep coming, forcing Nagumo's Zero fighters to scramble and his crews to pause their work. Chaos peaks at 10:20 a.m. While Japan's carriers are still a mess, planes half-armed, bombs stacked in hangars, fuel lines everywhere, American SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown dive from 10,000 feet. The Japanese carriers are caught flat-footed, with weak anti-aircraft fire and few Zero fighters at high altitude to stop the attack. In 5 to 6 minutes, bombs slam into Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, hitting hangars packed with fuel and munitions. The explosions are catastrophic secondary blasts from the stacked bombs, and fuel rip the ships apart. Akagi's deck is engulfed in flames. Kaga's hangar blows up, and Soryu's fuel tanks ignite, killing over 2,000 crew across the 3 ships. All 3 are out of action, effectively sunk by the end of the day. If Nagumo had stuck to one plan, either bombing Midway again or switching to torpedoes immediately, he could have had his planes ready to launch or defend. Instead, his indecision left the carriers vulnerable, with cluttered decks that turned small bomb hits into massive disasters. The US took advantage of this chaos thanks to their code-breaking intel and the sacrifice of their torpedo planes, which distracted Japan's defenses just long enough for the dive bombers to strike. The lesson? When the pressure's on, indecision can burn you. Nagumo's waffling cost Japan 3 carriers in minutes, changing the battle's outcome. In life, sometimes you've got to pick a path and commit, even if it's not perfect, because hesitating can lead to a bigger mess. Mistake 4. Assuming the US would follow Japan's planned picture, setting up a huge prank. Totally sure your buddy will walk right into it, because you've planned every detail. But turns out, they overheard your scheme and set up their own trap, making you look like a fool. That's Japan's 4th mistake at Midway. They assumed the US would act exactly as they predicted, not realizing the Americans had already turned the tables and were ready to strike. It's June 1942, 6 months after Japan's stunning attack on Pearl Harbor, and they're feeling unstoppable. Their navy, led by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, has a bold plan to seize Midway Atoll, a tiny speck in the Pacific, 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, to solidify their grip on the region. But Midway wasn't just about capturing an island. Japan's real goal was to lure the US Pacific Fleet, especially its 3 remaining aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, into a trap. The plan was textbook. Hit Midway, force the US to rush their carriers to defend it, then ambush them with Japan's 4 powerful carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Yamamoto was confident, figuring the US was still reeling from Pearl Harbor and would react predictably, sending their carriers in a panic to save the island, where Japan's superior numbers would crush them. Here's where it went wrong. Japan didn't know their secret was out. The US had cracked their naval code, JN-25, a complex cipher used for all their communications. By May 1942, American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had pieced together Japan's entire plan, where they'd strike, when, and with what forces. They even confirmed Midway was the target by sending a fake radio message from the island about a water shortage, which Japan's coded messages later referenced. This gave Admiral Chester Nimitz, the US Pacific Fleet Commander, a cheat sheet. He knew Japan's carriers would approach from the northwest, aiming to hit Midway on June 4th, 1942. Instead of falling for the trap, Nimitz flipped it. He positioned his 3 carriers, Task Force 16, with Enterprise and Hornet, under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, and Task Force 17 with Yorktown, under Vice Admiral Frank Fletcher, 200 miles northeast of Midway, out of Japan's sight, but close enough to strike. Japan, clueless about the broken code, assumed the US carriers were still in Pearl Harbor or would show up late to defend Midway. They didn't expect the Americans to be ready and waiting. On June 4th, while Japan's carriers were busy launching 108 planes to bomb Midway at 4:30 a.m., their decks cluttered with rearming chaos, the US was prepping their counterstrike. By 7 a.m., American scout planes had pinpointed Japan's fleet. At 10:20 a.m., SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown swooped in from high altitude, catching Japan off guard. In just 5 to 6 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were hit by bombs, erupting in flames from fuel and munitions on deck. Over 2,000 Japanese sailors and pilots died, and the carriers were lost, all because Japan didn't see the ambush coming. The fallout was devastating. Japan's plan hinged on the US reacting predictably, but Nimitz's foreknowledge let him outmaneuver them. If Japan had suspected their code was compromised, or even considered, the US might not take the bait. They could have scouted more aggressively, or kept their carriers on high alert. Instead, their assumption left them blind to the real threat. It's like thinking you've got your opponent figured out in a chess game, only to find they've been reading your moves all along. The lesson? Never assume your opponent will do what you expect. Japan was so sure of their strategy, they didn't plan for surprises. In life, whether you're running a business or making a big move, you've got to expect the unexpected and have a backup plan, because the other guy might just be one step ahead. Mistake 5. Weak defenses leave carriers exposed. Imagine you're playing basketball, and your team's so obsessed with scoring that you leave your basket wide open. The other team steals the ball, dunks, and you're left scratching your head. That's Japan's 5th mistake at Midway. Their defenses were so weak that their aircraft carriers, the heart of their fleet, were left vulnerable, practically inviting American planes to strike. On June 4th, 1942, Japan's 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, are steaming toward Midway Atoll, ready to dominate the Pacific. These carriers, carrying over 200 planes like the fearsome Zero fighters, Aichi D-3A dive bombers, and Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, are the same ones that crushed Pearl Harbor. At 4:30 a.m., Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding from Akagi, launches 108 planes to bomb Midway's airfields, aiming to knock out its defenses for an invasion. But when the US fights back, Japan's defensive setup falls apart, leaving their carriers exposed to a devastating attack. Japan's defense relied heavily on 2 things: their Zero fighters, which were top tier in dogfights, and anti-aircraft guns on the carriers. The Zeros were part of a Combat Air Patrol, CAP, circling above the fleet to intercept enemy planes. About 30 to 40 Zeros were assigned to this patrol at any given time, with more ready to launch. Sounds decent, right? But the US had a plan to mess it up. Starting around 7 a.m., American planes from Midway 6, TBF Avengers, 4 B-26 Marauders, and later, Marine SBD Dauntless and SB-2U Vindicator dive bombers launched wave after wave of attacks. These weren't super effective, scoring no direct hits, but they forced Japan's Zeros to dive to low altitude to chase them down. Zeros were deadly at low levels, shredding the slow American torpedo planes. But this left the high-altitude skies above the carriers nearly empty. Meanwhile, the carriers' anti-aircraft defenses were underwhelming. Each carrier had a mix of 25mm and 127mm guns, but these were outdated compared to later World War II standards, with slow tracking and limited range. Crews were trained, but the guns couldn't handle fast-moving dive bombers coming from high angles. To make matters worse, the carriers were in chaos from Nagumo's indecision about rearming planes. By 10 a.m., their decks and hangars were packed with bombs, torpedoes, fuel hoses, and planes being prepped for a counterstrike, basically a floating powder keg. At 10:20 a.m., the US struck. American SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown, led by commanders like Clarence McCluskey, dove from 10,000 feet. The Zeros, stuck at low altitude chasing torpedo planes like the TBD Devastators, couldn't climb fast enough to intercept. Only a handful of Zeros, maybe 10 to 15 across the fleet, were still at high altitude, and they were overwhelmed. The carrier's anti-aircraft fire was too weak to stop the Dauntlesses, which dropped bombs with deadly precision. In 5 to 6 minutes, Akagi was hit by 2 bombs, one igniting its hangar full of armed planes. Kaga took 4 bombs, its fuel tanks and munitions exploding. Soryu was struck by 3, setting off a chain of blasts. Over 2,000 Japanese sailors and pilots died as the 3 carriers became burning wrecks, all because their defenses couldn't hold. The fallout was catastrophic. Japan lost 3 carriers in one blow, with Hiryu following later that day. If they'd kept more Zeros at high altitude, say, doubling the cap to 60 planes, or improved their anti-aircraft systems, they might have blunted the U.S. attack. The American torpedo planes, though shot down in droves, played a key role. Their sacrifices pulled the Zeros low, clearing the way for the dive bombers. Japan's focus on offense bombing Midway left their carriers exposed, like a house with no locks. The lesson? No matter how strong your attack, you can't skimp on defense. Japan was so caught up in hitting Midway that they left their most valuable assets, the carriers, open to attack. In life, whether you're running a project or chasing a goal, you've got to cover your bases, because one weak spot can bring it all down. And there you have it, the 5 big mistakes Japan made at Midway. A scattered plan, lousy reconnaissance, hesitation, wrong assumptions about the U.S., and weak defenses. On June 4th, 1942, these errors cost Japan 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, plus over 3,000 men, including their best pilots. It was a blow they never recovered from. The U.S., despite losing the Yorktown and about 300 men, turned the tables, going from the underdog after Pearl Harbor to the leader in the Pacific. Midway wasn't just a battle, it was a turning point, like choosing the right path at a crossroads. Thanks to code breaking, the sacrifice of torpedo pilots, and bold moves by leaders like Chester Nimitz, the U.S. turned defeat into victory. Picture those young pilots, crammed in tight cockpits, knowing they might not come back, yet flying into danger. Or the sailors on Japan's carriers, facing walls of fire, trying to save their ships until the end. Their stories remind us that history isn't just dates or victories. It's about people, their choices, and their courage. Loved this story? Subscribe to my channel now for more gripping history tales, told simply, truthfully, and with heart. Hit that subscribe button or drop a comment, and you won't miss our next episodes about epic battles, heroes, and lessons from the past. Let's dive into history together. Join up today.